All right, thank you everybody for joining the Traffic Link user training. Um, Sorry for a little bit of a late start here, but we will get started, and we're going to cover a couple topics today, quite a bit to get through. Um, but as we like to do, kind of hit more kind of a larger audience. We're gonna do some basics here at the beginning about intersection health, some configuration concepts, some things to think about, and then and then later on in the presentation, Olivia is going to join us, and she's going to take us through some really fun examples. Um, but yeah, just to get us started, for those that don't know me, my name is Brent Rogerson. I'm an ITS sales engineer, so I focus quite a bit on helping out our customers leverage our platform, making sure it's being used to the maximum and you're getting the value that you're hoping to out of it. So I want to make sure that we provide some great content along the way here as well to help you do that and whatnot. I'm also joined here by Olivia, our in-house traffic engineering specialist. Maybe Olivia, you can say a quick hi if you're on the line.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm a traffic engineering specialist here at MyaVision, helping customers get a good idea of their data, what data is available to them, what the data means, and how to use that data to kind of derive value and make some changes to our traffic signal systems.
Awesome. I don't know why my photo is always so blurry. I gotta get myself a new photo. Um, So as I was mentioning, today I'm going to quickly go over intersection health, do a quick feature overview for any of those that are new on the call today, just to make sure I provide some foundational concepts there. Um, just a few items as well. I know I am going to be covering quite a bit, and we do typically move pretty fast in here. So if you do have questions or you do want some specific things answered, feel free to use the chat box in the GoToWebinar meeting tool. If you can ask some questions there, we'll try to answer them along the way, make sure that we help out. But we will be moving through the intersection health feature overview, some configuration points that I want to highlight, and then Olivia will get into some really fun examples. So let's get into it. Intersection health overview. So as many of you know, or if this is your first time and you have the performance measure module with our Traffic Link platform, we have a really powerful tool called intersection health. In intersection health, the purpose of this tool is to really surface actionable insights from the network of data that we have. We do understand that there is a lot of performance measures, there's a lot of data coming in from a network, and we have typically a lot of intersections connected, and not everybody has an unlimited amount of time in the world to really just sit there and look through data constantly. So what intersection health does is it really looks for common problems in the network that are very persistent in the network as well. So obvious things that could be fixed just by quickly looking through the data. And we'll resurface those problems through the intersection health tool to help you really take action more immediately and turn those data points into outcomes faster. Basically helps you get to the outcome that you're looking for without having to really spend all the time looking for a needle in a stack of needles. So there's three problems that the tool identifies, and I'll go through each one. The first problem is a suboptimal green split. This is highlighting an imbalance of performance between competing movements. So as an example, the northbound left versus a southbound through. They're competing movements, and what we're looking for in the data set and what the tool is actually trying to assess is where is there an excessive amount of spare capacity versus a high amount of split failures. So where are these imbalance between each other, and could they be resolved by just rebalancing the two movements together? So a good example of that is the image here on the right, that northbound left and the southbound through. But you can also see it through other movements like northbound through and eastbound through. So perpendicular movements that are working together and trying to find a balance. And sometimes some of those movements get too much time and they could just be simply reallocated. One thing to note about the timeframes of data that intersection health is actually assessing is we're looking at an entire month's worth of data every time we create an alert. So when we say that there is an imbalance of performance between the northbound left and southbound through, it's not necessarily just on a single day or a single moment in time. This is a very persistent problem that is there at least 50% of the days over the last month. So it is a very common problem before it becomes an alert. That means if it happens once in a while or happens like say one day in the network and it doesn't happen any other day, the alert will never pop up. But if it's very consistent and it's there always, the alerts will be there. The second issue that it identifies is called phase termination issues. This one is likely the more obvious one. It's around looking at minor movements and minor movements not terminating properly, essentially presenting itself with a excessive amount of spare capacity on a minor movement. So if you have a main line and it's actuating or it's essentially just using a fixed time maybe on that minor movement, you're going to end up in a scenario where maybe there's an alert sent for a phase termination issues. And this could be because of long minimum greens. So there maybe was one car that went through that minor movement, and then the next 15 seconds it was spare capacity. So there's just a long minimum there. Over design green time, passage time, extension time, lagging left turns, or concurrent left turns as well. And so these are all issues that may be causing it, or scenarios that may be causing a phase termination issue, but the tool helps highlight where this is occurring. There's a question that just popped up in the chat here. You will notice when you look at the alerts, it will highlight either AM or PM or weekday or weekend. The AM time frame is essentially before noon, so it's the entire morning period, the entire AM. So it's not around peak hours. It's the prior to noon, and then PM is the opposite, afternoon. It's everything. So basically cutting the day in half along that noon timeline. So it's not about the peak hours. It's basically more so saying that it's a little bit more general. So that's where you would actually turn to the performance measures to actually assess exactly when is it occurring in the morning period. Hopefully that answered your question. The last issue that it identifies, which is based on corridors, is around poor coordination. So essentially the operation that we would expect in a corridor or a coordinated corridor would be platoons of vehicles are actually able to smoothly traverse down a corridor. But in a poor coordination issue, this is not true. We see this in the time-space diagram where maybe there is suboptimal offsets. So the intersections aren't actually connecting in the way that you'd expect them to be. That could be through just offsets are wrong, or maybe cycle lengths are wrong, something like that. Or something more basic like a clock drift, which we have seen many times over, where it can be simply addressed by updating clocks or even using the GPS functionality in the MioVision SmartLink. So poor coordination is around actually assessing the ability for a platoon to traverse down a corridor. So we have these three major problems that our system identifies and tries to highlight where they are in the network to help you really take that alert and assess the situation, look through the performance measures, and create an outcome. And I believe Olivia has an example of that in a little bit. But one thing before we get into a few examples of those problems, I did want to highlight the importance of configuration. Very often as data users and our engineering efforts, data is incredibly important, and accuracy of that data is incredibly important. Very often you'll run into scenarios where maybe something doesn't quite look right, or it wasn't set up in the proper way, or maybe something has been changed and traffic link just simply hasn't been updated. And so it is important to think about how is it configured, because as the famous saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. So we have to make sure we understand how are things configured so that when you're actually assessing the data that you're looking at, you know you can trust the data. And trust in data is very important to us. And we spend a lot of time with our technical account managers trying to make sure all of our configurations are as accurate as possible. However, we don't necessarily know if a change has been made or maybe phasing timing plans have been different. And we have to account for that in TrafficLink. So sometimes we'll ask questions about certain phases and whatnot. But generally, when it comes to each one of these three issues, it does have a basic set of requirements. So when it comes to phase termination issue, we really, obviously need correct phasing. We need the stop bar detectors set up and associated properly with the phasing information. And on our approach configuration, there is a designation for major versus minor. And so actually assessing or properly designating which one is a major or a minor will actually help determine if a minor is not terminating properly. And then that's where that comes from. And if the minor simply wasn't added, you may just not get that alert. But the data would still be relevant. So we just got to make sure that we check some of these configuration boxes. If maybe we're not trusting the data or there's a question about the data that you're getting, start looking to some of these features. The next one down, green split allocation issue. This one very similar. This is about assessing majors versus minors and looking at where is their spare capacity versus split failures. So phasing, stop bar, major and minor are really what we look for. Poor coordination. Phasing is incredibly important. We need to know the progression of the signal status, understanding the approach speed. So this is an option that you can add in on the approach configuration page, making sure that you put in the expected speed of the road in there, so you can really understand the progression or the expected travel time of those vehicles. The major and minors, obviously, to understand which direction along the major, if that's the coordinated path, making sure that's configured properly. And then ultimately, it's actually set up as a corridor and configured in TrafficLink. So even corridors are a very important one. And as you start adding more intersections into the network, it is important to think about what is the definition of a corridor. MyVision currently uses at least 3 intersections up to 10 intersections configured together. And so making sure that you have all the right corridors set up, and they're very easy to add. We'd be happy to show you. Maybe in a future session, we can really break down these configurations and show you exactly how to do it. But these are very important pieces to make sure are done correctly, and we can use our technical account managers to make sure that they're helping us validate that. And you can always ask us questions and make sure we validate yours as well. I did see a quick question in there. Can we get these slides? Absolutely. I'll send these out over. We can send these out after the session here. Just building on a couple more points for the configuration side. Common reasons why we do see discrepancies or we do need to check or update the configurations. Sometimes the controller gets changed, the timing plans get changed, maybe there's a new phase added for protected left, or maybe a new detector channel set is now being used. We often see the new channel one or the new detector system one be when a customer goes from, say, loop detection over to MyVision detection, and it goes from, say, a different detector rack to a new detector rack. We just have to update it in kind and make sure that the right detectors are associated with the right phase. And then ultimately, if you're watching the telemetry and you don't feel like it is matching what you expect it to match, or it's not populating in the way you thought it would, it's most likely just a configuration problem, and our connection to the controllers are pretty good. So always double check some of those phasing and detector channels. Common ones that we do run into, just to think about a couple examples, and I'll show you on the next page what I mean by this, but detector metrics are not assigned correctly in the configuration. We often see an advanced detector configured versus a stop bar detection. And when you're on the page, it actually highlights what metrics are enabled by what detector type. And so one of them is stop bar. Stop bar enables your split trends, your occupancy ratios, and basically all the stop bar metrics that you can come up with. And then if you designate it as an advanced detector channel, then it would be all about approach volumes or arrivals on reds and the other sets of metrics that enable other performance measures. So sometimes if there's a mix match on what the purpose of the detector channel is, and it's not set as stop bar, you may end up in a scenario where just the chart's not populated, or it just doesn't look quite right. The other one is protected versus permissive lefts. When say a protected is a when a left turn is protected, there's often also a permissive version of the left on the through movement as well, and making sure we're designating those properly. And I'll show you that in a second here. But even as a through movement, I very often see a through movement or a through phase. So like say phase 6 through is actually set up as permissive when it's supposed to be protected. All through movements are protected in our system. And so just double checking some of these configuration items will help populate the charts. And very often, if it's not set up right, the chart will just be blank or all red. So just to double down on that, what I'm talking about is this configuration page here, where in the signal configuration, if you go to that bottom left gear in the intersection dashboard in TrafficLink, it brings you to a page that looks like this. It allows you to label a phase, decide what type of traffic you're expecting there, the direction, the approach, and is it protected or permissive. So as I was saying with the westbound left, phase 1, it is a protected phase on its own. When it turns on, it is a protected phase. And then on the westbound through phase 6, it is a protected through phase that happens to also have a left permissive. And so this is how we set these up to make sure that charts are associating the data properly. If you see scenarios like this and hints that the configuration may not be, these may be hints that the configuration are not quite right. When you see all blue or maybe a blank chart or a red chart, these are generally just configuration problems and they can easily be resolved. The great news about all of this is that you don't actually lose the data either. So as long as we are connected to it, the data can always be regenerated. So we could just fix the configuration and then regenerate the data all the way back to when it was originally plugged in. And so all of these things are easily fixable, and then we can just regenerate the data so you haven't lost anything from our database. And then you'll get back to where you started. So if you see anything like this, don't worry. We often can get it back and we can just fix the configuration and get you back on track. Those are things you should just look out for and know about so that you can adjust as you're looking through the data. And maybe we'll spend a whole bunch more time in our next session actually configuring for performance measures in further depth. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Olivia to take us through some more intersection health examples. If that makes sense, maybe I'll hand this over to Olivia. If I can do that. Make presenter. Are you able to take that, Olivia?
I believe so. Can you see my screen now?
Oh, yep, perfect.
Okay, great. All right, thanks, Brent. So I'm going to go through one example of a suboptimal green split. It's going to tie into our configuration as well. And then I'm going to take you through a couple more use cases. So yeah, to get started, we have our suboptimal green split example. Again, just as a reminder, suboptimal green split is looking at an imbalance in performance between the movements. So here we have an intersection with a suboptimal green split for the PM weekend. You can see right off the bat, we have quite a few split failures in that westbound left turn movement, so 28% there. And then also right off the bat, maybe not directly related, but potentially concerning, or at least I think is concerning when I see this, is northbound through has 98% spare capacity. So definitely something I'm going to look into when I look at these sorts of alerts. So to begin with, I like to pull up our split trend graphs in this view here, which is in the analysis tab, showing all of our movements and how they're all operating. So here I've pulled up 4 weeks of data in June for the weekend, and I've just narrowed it down from noon until 10 p.m., which is our PM time frame. And we can kind of immediately see that westbound left, like was shown on the previous page, does have quite a few split failures going on, especially kind of from noon to around 8 p.m., where the opposing movement has a lot of spare capacity. So that eastbound through movement definitely has some room where maybe we could take some green time and reassign it. Some other things to notice here, there is also spare capacity in that westbound through movement. So if the eastbound through and the westbound through are tied together, we can kind of remove time from both of them. Both of them seem to be not using that green time super effectively, as well as the eastbound left movement is operating pretty well. So if the eastbound left and the westbound left are tied together and we end up giving them a bit more green time, that might appear as a bit more spare capacity in that eastbound left turn. If they're not tied together, then that's great. We don't need to give that eastbound left turn any more time because it's operating pretty well as is. And then lastly, there's still a concerning amount of spare capacity in that northbound through and southbound through movement. So you can see there, it looks like hardly any vehicles are using that movement. In my mind, that doesn't make sense, so it's definitely something we're going to look into. So first, to cover the split failures here, we're going to zoom in on that westbound left movement again. So again, showing us some split failures from about 11 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then I'm going to dive into the phase interval graph and see how much green time I'm actually getting here. It is looking like our westbound left is maxing out pretty frequently from about noon to 5:30 and reaches that green max of about 10 seconds. So pretty quick phase. And then the opposite direction, again, we have quite a bit of spare capacity there. And it is getting quite a lot of green time, not necessarily extending very frequently. My computer says I'm experiencing network connection. Brent, can you still hear me?
Yep, it still sounds fine.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, eastbound movement, getting a lot of time, not necessarily extending and not necessarily using that time, but it is getting up to 46.6 seconds of green minimum time from about noon to 5:30. So here, the cycle length is 150 seconds, which is quite long, from 9:30 to 9 p.m. In this case, the eastbound and westbound through movements have a lot of spare capacity, so they could likely reduce that minimum green time by a few seconds, and we could also increase that westbound left green max, specifically from about 11 to 8 p.m., maybe up by a few seconds. 10 seconds is pretty quick. So, and then, so that kind of covers that. But again, I did want to look into those weird northbound, southbound issues. So here I'm looking at the phase interval graphs for our northbound and southbound, and it looks like the movements are getting extended. So to me, this means that in order to get an extension, obviously you need a detector call. But based on our split trend graphs, it doesn't look like we're getting any detector calls. So when you compare them, just for example, if we were getting a lot of use out of these movements and a lot of use of that detection zone, lots of vehicles moving through, we would see just generally more color, probably more green for okay, where we're getting a lot of use out of this, maybe some split failures, but here it's really quite empty. So it kind of is three possible options. So it's either that the northbound, southbound detectors just aren't working well at all. Maybe they're older or just not set up properly. It could be that the configuration is incorrect, or there's just way too much green time for both movements. Again, that doesn't really seem possible because we are getting those extensions there. So it's likely option 1 or 2. So we did do a bit of investigation. We basically, when this kind of happens, I'll reach out to our customer to see if they've changed anything or updated anything or if they know what's going on. So basically what it ended up being is that they did have some advanced detection in the northbound, southbound movement, but it was configured as stop bar detection. So obviously that's not correct, and that's why that data looked a little bit funky. So we did update it. We did regenerate the data, as Brent said, that is possible. So the data has been updated, and you can see that in this view, we no longer have that northbound and southbound through movement in these split trend graphs, just because we don't actually have stop bar detectors there. So they're no longer included in this graph. So this is kind of updated data for the last 4 weeks. It still looks like we do have that westbound left issue, but the data is definitely now correct, and we don't have that weird spare capacity issue with the northbound, southbound. So that's the end of that example. So now I'm just going to get into a couple of examples of use cases, kind of different ones that we haven't yet covered using ATS-PM data. So we have a customer in California that has been using our data to kind of make a couple decisions, make a couple changes. So I'm just going to highlight a few of those. So the first one is related to offset improvements along a corridor. Just for context, this is 3rd Street. So 3rd Street is a one-way going westbound kind of into the downtown core from the highway. So this is westbound. So we're reading this time space diagram from bottom to top going westbound into the city. This is February 24th, so at about 8:15, which we would assume is kind of around the AM peak. And we can see that coordination isn't great. So for good coordination, we're expecting kind of those time space bands to be pretty thick, pretty consistently the same thickness and kind of occurring every cycle. So here you can see kind of we have not very much of that. We have it kind of for the first 2 or 3 intersections, and then coordination just drops off entirely. So what happened is the customer actually is working with an engineering firm, and the engineering firm saw that the coordination was poor based on these graphs and decided to try to make a change. I'm not sure of the exact date of when that happened, but it was kind of sometime between February and May. And you can see that there's been great improvement in this graph on the right there, May 26th, same time. Now we can see that there's good coordination here. We have those time space bands kind of going bottom to top again. Pretty consistent width happening basically every cycle. There is one cycle that kind of gets dropped. That's here at the bottom. That's actually when a train comes in, so that does occur. Nothing you can really do about that, but generally really consistent coordination. Yeah, so basically with that, the customer asked us to look into travel time because kind of intuitively you would think that as coordination improves, you do get improved travel time. That just makes sense. You're hitting those greens kind of back to back to back. You should have a faster travel time. So we did look into that. And what I found was kind of disappointing for me at first, because if you're just looking at travel time from kind of one end to the other, this is our travel time metric if you're not familiar. We're looking from one end of the corridor to the other in the westbound direction, obviously, it's a one-way. Again, from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. and looking kind of February, March, comparing to May, June. And what you'll notice is that the difference in travel time is basically nothing. It's actually 1 second, and it's 1 second worse. So again, when I was looking at this at first, pretty disappointed. I thought there would be definitely some change, maybe not super significant, but some change. In this case, 1 second difference, so not much of a change. But I dug a little further. I wasn't really done with that yet, wasn't ready to drop it. Looked into volumes. So looked at our turning movement counts along this corridor and found, kind of looked at a week in February, looked at a couple weeks in February, and found kind of a throughput volume around 20,000 vehicles, the majority of vehicles using 3rd Street going westbound through, not many turning vehicles. And then I was curious what was happening kind of in the May-June timeframe. And we found that there were about 4,000 more vehicles moving through that corridor. So basically what that meant was that with improved coordination, there was no impact to travel time, but we were able, in the same travel time, able to fit 4,000 more vehicles through that corridor in throughout the day from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. So pretty significant kind of gains there. Not exactly what we thought with travel time, but travel time remained the same, and now they are able to fit 4,000 more vehicles through that corridor in the day. So just the last part of that. So in our last session, I believe we talked about the report card tool and how you can use it kind of for before and after. In this case, I wanted to see what the travel time tool looked like since, the report card tool looked like since it shows a lot of travel time metrics. And like I said, travel time didn't change much. It's kind of the case here. It's not anything super significant since it was more of a volume thing, but we'll just go through this example anyway. So I set up a template to look at kind of a month of data in June compared to a month of data in March. So our primary data, the kind of bold, bigger data here is June, and then the baseline data that we're comparing it to is March. So you can see level of service hasn't changed, still an A, still great. Not a lot of delay happening, a slight increase in delay, and a very, very small increase in travel time. Obviously, that 1 second translates to a very small change, 0.9%. And all of those are sort of related. We calculate level of service based on that travel time index. So if there's not a huge change in travel time index, there's not a huge change in level of service. We did see an increase, a slight increase in reliability. Again, when you improve coordination and it's a more reliable coordination kind of happening every cycle, that's expected, that reliability will improve. And then we did have split failures improve slightly as well. Split failures for a corridor in this case are just looking at the direction of the corridor. So where this is just a westbound corridor, we're only looking at split failures in the westbound direction. So that makes sense. We're improving coordination, we're improving split failures in the westbound direction. And then lastly, major street arrivals on red. We don't have any data here because we don't have upstream detection at this intersection along this corridor. So we don't have any data there, but if we did have upstream detection, we would likely expect that the major street arrivals on red did decrease just because we're improving that coordination. We would expect more vehicles are arriving on green kind of consistently through that corridor. So that is the end of that example.
Yeah, Olivia.
Yep.
There's a quick question. If you can go back a couple more slides.
Sure, I can't, for some reason, I can't see the question, so
Okay,
thank you for
I'll read it out to you. If you go back one more.
One more.
Yeah, up in the top right corner here. Yep. The question, so I'll just read the question now. On the 3rd Street offset example, the slide says speeds were set at 35 miles per hour. Was this a change to the corridor to improve coordination, or was the corridor always posted at 35?
Sorry, yeah. So the reason I put that there, the corridor was always set at 35. It's just within our tool, you can change the speed when you're looking at the space time or the time space diagram. So here I kept it at 35. If you wanted to go into the tool and change it to 30 to see if that improved coordination, you could, or set it to 40 and see if that improved coordination, which probably wouldn't be a good thing, but I just wrote that there to show that that is the speed limit, that is what this diagram is set at, but you can also change the diagram to see kind of what effect that has on coordination.
So it's almost like it's almost semi-simulation. You can almost simulate what would happen if you just changed the speed limit versus just changing the offsets or something like that.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, great. That was the only question. Thank you for that.
No problem. Sorry, I have so many fade-ins. It'll take me a second to get back. Okay, all right. So we're in our second example here, which is kind of an economic development example. So here, I was looking through data for this customer, San Rafael, trying to look for some interesting data. I was in their turning movement counts, and I noticed for some reason volumes just completely fell off one Friday. And I was concerned because I thought maybe there was a collision or something like that. I didn't have access to video, so I couldn't tell. Kind of went back another day, Thursday, same thing, drop off of volume, went back a couple weeks, and everything was fine. So I did a little research and found that starting on March 11th, San Rafael had started this program called Dining Under the Lights. So we were still kind of, we still kind of are in the middle of the pandemic, but back in March, still the pandemic. Trying to encourage people to frequent businesses safely, eat outdoors at these restaurants. So basically what they did was they started shutting down one of their downtown streets, 4th Street, between a couple of intersections, and to open up these businesses so they could have kind of a bigger patio into the street, so they could attract more people, hopefully encourage people to walk there and to frequent their businesses. So I was able to kind of immediately see that in the data, and I just wanted to see what impact that had also on pedestrian data. So I looked at 3 of the intersections where vehicles were kind of no longer operating during that time. So 4th Street and C, 4th Street and D, 4th Street and E, and kind of set a baseline of data. Baseline of data kind of a month before that, looking at Thursdays and Fridays, which you can see here is kind of the blue data. That's kind of daily pedestrian volumes. And then compared to the first, I think, month of the program. So that's the red, dining under the lights, DUTL, and found that after the first 3 weeks of the program, pedestrian traffic had actually increased at these 3 intersections by 32%. So just a different way of using our turning movement count data to kind of reinforce if these sorts of programs were a success. You can reinforce that to the public or to council or to whoever you need, but definitely a handy tool for this and definitely a successful program here. And then last example here, looking at pedestrian compliance, again in the same area, 4th Street. So basically, San Rafael had been looking at their pedestrian compliance charts, and 4th Street were kind of focused on turning 4th Street into a more pedestrian-friendly area. In San Rafael, 2nd Street and 3rd Street are kind of more commuter streets in and out of downtown, where 4th Street is a 2-way and is kind of intended to be more pedestrian-friendly. So they were looking at ways they could maybe improve pedestrian compliance here. So they decided to change their cycle lengths kind of between 6:30 a.m. and 2 p.m. from 90 seconds to 75 seconds to see what sort of a difference that might make. So in the top, you can see what the kind of timing plan looked like before. You can see what it looks like after. And I looked at the data kind of start of June as the baseline, and then looked at after data end of June as well as July to see what sort of an impact happened there. And we found that the most significant difference was at 4th and C. That did make a significant impact there, significant reduction in pedestrian compliance. And overall at these 3 intersections, we did see a reduction in non-compliance of 6%. So in this case, non-compliance meaning pedestrians were walking through the crosswalk during the don't walk phase. Yeah, so a reduction in 6%, definitely a good start. Hopefully they'll continue kind of trying things here, but definitely a positive result. I think that's it for me. Brent, were there any more questions or anything you wanted to add?
No, there were no more questions, but we do have about 15 minutes. And I was thinking, if you have no other examples, maybe I could just jump in and do a quick tour of TrafficLink and the performance measures, maybe?
Sure. I guess I can stop showing that screen and then that goes back to you.
Yes, and then I believe I can make me presenter again. Oh, that's cool. That's handy. Just a quick check. You can see my screen now?
Yeah, sorry.
Perfect. Okay. I know in many of these sessions, there's quite a bit of content, so I do like the idea of sending out the slides afterwards so that you can kind of think through some of the material that you're seeing here and think about different ways you could apply all of the data sources as well, because we have the phase data, we have the detector data, we have count data, and then we even have the spatial awareness data like our safety metrics. And so if this is somewhat your first time getting into it, I'll just do a quick iteration of some of those features and just where they are, and we'll see in the meantime if there's any more questions that anybody specifically wants to ask in the last 15 minutes here, but I'll do a quick little tour in the meantime. So I just logged into TrafficLink, and if you're a performance measure user, you'd be familiar with some of this. Along the left here, we have all of our major global icons. So like your first context is just your main map, and then with your deployments on it, you could look over to where are the alerts in my intersection for infrastructure perspective. So like, is everything working in my intersection as expected? Because that is one of the starting points of the data. Often when I think about data, I don't necessarily jump to, is the timing plan wrong? I actually start with, is everything operating the way I expect it to operate, and just do a simple observational moment to see what's going on. Um, and I sometimes use those alerts to just see if maybe some of those intersections are the way they are, or the data looks the way they are, just because of maybe ongoing detector alert issues from advanced detectors, or from missing information that maybe we should have to help make a bigger picture of data. So if you're kind of connecting the two dots, uh, often when we are connected only in with just our SmartLink, and we're just reading existing infrastructure like loops in the ground or controller data, and we're just pulling in what already exists, often the solution is adding something like the MyOvervision SmartSense to derive at the missing components. So like a missing left turn, or if you say you don't have stop bar on the through stop bar movements, because it always rests on that through, and then you only have your actuation or your loops in the ground based on minors or lefts, you can simply add a SmartSense detection unit to even virtually collect that data. So you don't even have to you don't necessarily even have to actuate based on our zones that we draw in our system. You could just simply use it for data. And many of our customers do that today as a way to just generate the right data. But looking along the left here, I'll go down to the Insights tab where our intersection health is, and a lot of the kind of starting. I often think of intersection health as the starting point. So often when Olivia's doing her exercises and she's looking through that data, we often start with this perspective. Is it an ongoing problem? Is it an ongoing alert? Is it a major issue? Sometimes they're very specific issues, or specific scenarios or programs, like dining under the lights. We're just trying to assess volume changes or performance changes based on a very specific scenario. But for the most part, you're looking at major operational consistency in data. And when you have a large deployment like this, intersection health becomes a very helpful tool. And so just a couple highlights in here and how to interact with this. I did mention earlier that it is looking at the last 30 days. So we're in August now. So the data that's being presented right now is based on July. So this is basically the performance of what happened in July. We are working on trend level information. We do internally at MyOvervision have the trend data. So we're starting to come up with mock-ups and designs about what trend data could look like. So if you were to compare, say, every month over month, did it improve? Or has this alert been present for, say, 4 months out of the year versus just the last 30 days? We're starting to think a lot about trend level information. But for now, we're just in the platform, we're presenting the active alerts or the active scenarios. But if you want more data, feel free to reach out and we can help you out. So let's take a look at a couple of these. And you can see as I just highlight over the map, it just interacts with it really well. Let's look at maybe, where's this one down here? Let's look at a phase termination issue. And so just as Olivia was showing in one of her examples there, immediately when you click on the alert, it does bring you to the particular intersection and the particular moment in time and highlight the data that we're looking at. So this is a phase termination issue in the AM weekday. And as I mentioned before, there's AM, PM weekdays and AM, PM weekends. And AM is defined as before noon. Or afternoon. So it's a pretty generalized time period. That's why performance measures like split trends, you'd actually want to dig in deeper to that time of day. Look at where are the timing plans scheduled to be. Maybe there's a peak hour timing plan that then gets switched during the day in some way. So you really want to dig into exactly when that is through the performance measures, but this gives you a pretty powerful starting point to do that assessment. So here we clicked on that first phase termination issue, and it's highlighting this eastbound left turn. It's basically calling it out because there is a 83% spare capacity on this movement. There isn't a whole lot of split failures on the other movements. There is some spare capacity on our westbound movements as well. However, this is a very significant amount of time on a left turn. So potential opportunity to rebalance this and dig a little bit further. Let me see. we have a suboptimal green. Oh. We have a suboptimal green split. We'll click on that one. Similar idea. Let's find one that has a little bit more data in it. Multiple problems. All right, here we go. Here's one with a little bit more. So you can see when you click on one, it still highlights exactly where the problem is. In this case, there is only a single time period on the weekend that it's highlighting for a suboptimal green split. But here what it's looking at is we have our northbound through that has 21% spare capacity and 51% split failures. And then when we look at some of our other movements like southbound left here, we do have 24% spare capacity. And so between the left turns and the throughs, is there an opportunity to do some rebalancing? And looking at all of those factors of spare capacity and split failures can really help us make a decision. However, it is looking at a single intersection, and we do recognize that there could be upstream or downstream impacts to simply changing a balanced approach at a particular intersection. That may change coordination or may change just your intended design. We don't necessarily know all of the factors in our platform for particular priorities. So as an example, if you're actually prioritizing pedestrian operations, say around a university campus or whatever it may be, you may be purposefully creating that scenario where you want progression to be slower or you want it to be different and it's a particular outcome. That's why traffic engineers make those types of decisions. They balance out those priorities appropriately. And so we're just highlighting the data to you, and then from your knowledge of the area, the intersections, you can drill down and figure out what is the right option for this particular issue, if there is any action to take. So this doesn't necessarily mean you have to acknowledge this task or actually go out and make a change. It's an opportunity to make an improvement if it makes sense to do so. Here's a port coordination one. So in a let me go back to that one. So if I go back to the actual corridor, so we have a coordinated corridor along this road here, and it looks like there is a couple issues along it, but these are intended to be coordinated. But the one right in the middle is having a poor progression quality issue highlighted, and it's saying northbound and southbound. So this is actually using that time-space diagram. It's trying to understand what is the progression in terms of those bands, and it's highlighting that it is not successful at this single intersection in the middle, and it's only highlighting the intersection in the middle. So we can take this information, we can go to our analysis tab. Let's grab that name. We'll go over to our analysis tab where we can even start generating those corridor charts. What's that one? Time space diagram. And we'll just pick a time of day. And so from here, we can actually start seeing where is it breaking down and how well these progressions actually working. And so when Olivia was actually showing the speed limit up at the top here, you can see how you can simply make an adjustment to what if scenario if you were to make a change to the time or to the speed of the road, i.e. like if you were to like slow it down, does that make it better? Or is it really the offsets and getting into the offsets between these intersections to make improvements? Oh, I see that there's a question. Let me see. So there's a quick question here. Maybe Olivia, you can help me out with it. I would like some rules of thumb as to how to interpret the percentages in intersection health. Sometimes 25% is spare capacity, sometimes 25% is okay, sometimes 25% is split failure. Oh, I wonder if it actually just makes sense to explain the split failure chart. Let me go back to what you're talking about there.
Yeah, so the numbers within like Brent is showing there, that is directly just reading the split trend chart. So that's where those numbers are coming from. So yeah, maybe best to explain the split trend chart.
Yeah, let me just jump to that help article because it has a nice handy diagram on it. Where's my
Bottom right.
Oh, let's see, actually we can go through. I just wanted to get this help article. So each one of our charts does have a help article that does explain it further. And there's a handy little chart here that I like to use to understand what those indications mean. So you can see the coloring scheme matches here on this chart. So when we say spare capacity, that means of the green part of the phase, so the green occupancy ratio is less than 60% occupied for that particular cycle. And the red occupancy ratio of the first 5 seconds is less than 60%. So that means there's not a whole lot of demand for this particular phase during this cycle. And so that would be your spare capacity. Then green being okay, which is where we want to be, it means that we're between 60 and 100% of that phase had a percentage of occupancy. So that means we're adequately using that phase and serving the demand of that phase adequately. And the amount of vehicles left over when the light turns red is very minimal. So it is really focusing on that first 5 seconds of red, and are there cars left over, and is the green phase being used adequately? And that would be okay. Random arrivals are kind of we don't focus on it a whole lot, but we know it happens in the data. This is when your green occupancy percentage is low, but people are arriving as soon as the light turns red. And so it's really hard to indicate where did they come from, maybe a gas station and they just popped into the network randomly from a house or whatever it may be. So we classify the ones in this box as random arrivals. Purple is heavy traffic. So this is looking at a high percentage of green occupancy, and we're approaching a fairly high percentage of vehicles left over when the light turns red. And then ultimately, the red box here in the top corner is a split failure, where 100%, 80 to 100% of the time that green phase has a very high occupancy percentage, so it's being used consistently, and there's cars being left over indicating that the demand wasn't serviced adequately. So that would be called a split failure there. So basically what we do is we take this for every cycle at the intersection, for every phase at the intersection, and make sure that we classify every one of those time blocks, and then we just basically add up how often does that happen at an intersection through these plots, and then we turn that into trend level information in the intersection health to determine where is this happening too frequently. Anything else you'd add to that, Olivia?
No, I think you covered it well.
Perfect. Hopefully that somewhat answered the question here. I do know that in the intersection health alert itself, there's a little bit of a balance of what is a high enough percentage. So it's not necessarily a threshold based indication, it's a relative indication in the sense of, is there a large percentage of spare capacity or a large percentage of split failure when there is not in the opposing movement or in the other movement. So it's a little bit relative and a little bit of the secret sauce of how do we calculate when there is a suboptimal green split and it is relative to the actual intersection itself. But generally that's what it's looking for, is just an imbalance in a ratio. So there's no real threshold based indication of that. It's just a relative imbalance that we have noticed, and then you can get into the exact data around what may be going on at that intersection. Hopefully that helps. I'd be happy to reach out and see if there is any more questions on that. Maybe we can keep unpacking what that may look like in your city or in your region, and we'll figure it out further. That was a good question, though. Well, we have only about one minute left, and maybe we'll just wrap up there. Did I have my slide deck? Here it is. So I do recognize a lot of content. Please feel free to reach out to Olivia or myself. Contact your sales rep, your partner, whoever you comfortable working with, and let us know if you have any questions. We do have a help center with lots of videos and knowledge base material where you can go self-serve what you may be looking for. So please go in and explore, watch some videos, ask some questions. We'd be happy to help. But yeah, thank you so much for joining the session today, and I'll be following up with some of the slides to see if there's any other questions. But thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.